The small coastal village of Ravensearch was notorious for its thick, cloying fog that would roll in from the sea every evening, swallowing the landscape in an eerie gray shroud. The villagers had long learned to respect the fog, believing it carried whispers of restless spirits, warnings passed down from their ancestors. Visitors scoffed at the stories, dismissing them as superstitious nonsense, until they stayed long enough to hear the echoes themselves. Sophia was one such skeptic. A city journalist looking for her next big story, she arrived in Ravensreach during the late autumn season, armed with a notebook, a camera, and her ever-present skepticism. She rented a small cottage on the edge of the village, its windows overlooking the cliffs where the waves endlessly battered the jagged rocks below. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, a constant reminder of the sea's omnipresence. The villagers were polite but wary, avoiding her probing questions about the fog and its supposed mysteries. Only the town's oldest resident, an ancient woman named Agnes, seemed willing to talk. "Stay indoors when the fog comes," Agnes warned, her pale eyes unblinking. "And if you hear voices calling your name, no matter what you think you hear, do not follow." Sophia smiled politely but dismissed the old woman's words as nothing more than folklore. That evening she settled into her cottage, the faint strains of villagers' activity fading as night fell. By the time she realized how silent it had become, the fog had already crept in, wrapping around the house like a suffocating embrace. Sitting by the window, Sophia watched as the world outside vanished. The fog pressed against the glass, tendrils of gray twisting and curling as if alive. She grabbed her camera, hoping to capture some atmospheric shots for her article. As she framed the first image, she thought she saw something, a faint shadow moving through the mist. A trick of the light, she told herself, but unease prickled at her skin. The shadow appeared again, closer this time. It was a man, or at least the shape of one. His movements were slow, deliberate, and oddly disjointed. Sophia squinted, her fingers hovering over the shutter button. When the figure suddenly vanished, a cold chill slid down her spine. That was when she heard it, a soft voice, barely above a whisper, drifting through the fog. "Sophia!" Her breath caught. She stood frozen, unsure if she had imagined it. But then it came again, more insistent this time. "Sophia, come outside!" She shuddered. Her rational mind screamed at her to stay indoors, to listen to the warnings she had dismissed earlier. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pushed her to move. She wrapped herself in a heavy coat and cautiously opened the front door. The cold hit her like a wall, the fog clinging to her skin and hair. She stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath her weight. "Hello," she called, her voice swallowed instantly by the fog. There was no reply, just the oppressive silence. Then the whispers began. They came from all directions, disembodied and impossible to trace. Words half-formed, gibberish interspersed with fragments of her name. Sophia's heart pounded as the voices grew louder, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. She stumbled forward, trying to orient herself, but the fog was disorienting, twisting her surroundings into an unfamiliar nightmare. "Sophia!" One voice called, closer now. Desperate to regain her bearings, she turned back toward the cottage but froze in horror. It was gone. The path she had walked moments ago had vanished, replaced by endless gray. She was alone. "This isn't real," she whispered, clutching her coat tighter. But the voices didn't care for her disbelief. They swirled around her, each one pulling her deeper into the mist. Shapes began to emerge, human-like figures formed of smoke and shadow. Their faces were voids, their mouths open in silent screams. One stepped closer. Its hand, skeletal and dripping with seaweed, reached out to her. Sophia stumbled back, her foot catching on something, a tangle of rotted rope half buried in the ground. The stench of salt and decay filled her nostrils, and she realized she had wandered dangerously close to the cliffs. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and in the chaos she could make out a single, chilling phrase: "Join us." Sophia's mind raced as she backed away from the edge. She fumbled for her phone, but when she glanced at the screen, she saw her own terrified reflection staring back. The phone slipped from her hands and shattered on the rocks below. The figures surrounded her now, circling slowly, their hollow faces looming closer. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the charm necklace her grandmother had given her years ago, a gift she had dismissed as an old superstition. Under her breath, she whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. The figures halted. The whispers subsided into an eerie silence. When Sophia opened her eyes, the fog had lifted just enough for her to see the faint outline of her cottage. Without hesitation, she ran, her footsteps pounding against the wet earth. The figures didn't follow, but she could feel their presence lingering in the mist, watching. She burst through the door and locked it behind her, her chest heaving with sobs. Through the window, she could see the fog retreating, as if it had lost interest in her. But she knew better. It was not over. Sophia packed her belongings and fled Raven's Reach at first light. The villagers watched her go, their faces etched with pity and quiet understanding. She never published the story she had come to write. In the weeks that followed, she avoided mirrors, ignored phone calls, and slept with every light in her apartment on. But the fog found her again. One night, as she sat alone in her living room, a chill filled the air. From outside her window came a familiar sound, a whisper carried on the wind. "Sophia,